What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and my guest today is a longtime friend. You're gonna find out why. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. We're in a major crisis in America, and his name is Antonio De Loera. What's going on, man?
Hey, how are you?
I feel like I said your name like a gringo.
You got pretty close. And in fairness, I mean, I am a gringo myself. If we're going by the strictly citizenship definition, I am a proud Mexican American. You know, what a time to be a Mexican American, I have to say, and from California, no less.
Yeah. That's part of the interest in this conversation, or the urgency of it. We first connected on the Julian Castro presidential campaign, running for president in 2020. Maybe we can dip into that a bit too. But currently you work as the comms director for UFW, United Farm Workers, which is a glorious organization. It has like a storied history with Cesar Chavez. I want to get into all of your personal shit, but would you mind just giving I don't know if you have like a 30-second spiel about UFW and the history there?
Yeah, well, the United Farm Workers, or in Spanish, La Unión de Campesinos, is the nation's largest and oldest labor union for agricultural workers, founded by Cesar Chavez, Larry Idalong, Dolores Huerta, Gil Padilla, and others in the early 60s. Really came of age during the civil rights movement, but I always think of it as actually kind of trying to do the New Deal's unfinished business, right? In the 1930s, farm workers were excluded from a lot of national labor laws, like the right to form a union. That exclusion still exists, by the way, in federal law. It's only a handful of states that give farm workers the right to unionize in the United States. And that's what the UFW was all about. It was about saying, hey, we are some of the poorest workers in America. We do some of the most difficult but also important jobs. And we should have a right to form a union so that we can do what unions do, which is raise wages, get pensions, get contracts, right? So that's been our history. It's been, I would say we're a really gritty union. Most farm workers, I'll be honest, are not unionized, in large part because of that historic exclusion I mentioned. And then also, it's just difficult to organize an industry where not only are most workers working paycheck to paycheck and thus terrified of getting fired, they're it's a significantly immigrant workforce. So the UFW really exists to try to address that exclusion, that historic exclusion of farm workers from labor law. And this is a hard group of workers to organize. They're living paycheck to paycheck, which makes them really vulnerable to getting fired, which is the most common form of retaliation. And then on top of that, this is a primarily immigrant workforce, somewhere between 50 to 70%, depending on where exactly in the country you are, mostly of immigrant origin. I will say often people forget that there are also U.S. citizens who are doing this work. I hate when people say, oh, Americans won't do these jobs, because somewhere between maybe 30 to 40% of the workforce are in fact U.S. citizens, or at least green card holders. And I think sometimes we don't think of them that way because they're Mexican American. And so they kind of fall through the cultural cracks of what it means to be an American, maybe. But this is an industry where workers really need a union, but often really struggle to have one. And that's the social gap that the UFW has been trying to fill for 60 years.
So the UFW only comes into existence because agricultural workers who were in a pretty vulnerable position, and I mean, and still are, obviously, in a lot of ways, but they literally fought for this. They went on strike and organized and made a lot of noise. And like you said, they're kind of on the gig, almost like the gig economy, in the sense that it's 1099 type work, right?
Right. Well, I'll this is a metaphor I often use. I always say, right, so the New Deal happens in the 1930s, but agriculture is excluded. And that's just straight up racism, where in order to get the National Labor Relations Act through Congress, there were all sorts of compromises required with the segregationist senator
The New Deal
lobby.
was super racist,
Right.
and
Well, they
not
just had
only
to,
toward black people.
right. And I mean, in fairness, one of the big arguments here is at that point in our history, a lot of the agricultural work was being still done by African American sharecroppers in the South. And of course, you also had large Latino, primarily Mexican, and also Asian immigrant groups out in the West doing this work. And just a political decision was made that we're going to give the right to organize to this group of workers who we see as predominantly white, and we're going to deny it to this group of workers that we see as predominantly not white. And so, we just didn't get in on that kind of those glory days of high union density, good pension jobs, all those jobs that we romanticize a lot today, that union way of life. That never happened for farm workers. And then in the 1960s, we start going, and I want to be very clear here. The UAW bankrolled the UFW's first union hall, right? The UFW
United
would not
Auto
have been able.
Workers Union.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The UFW would not have been able to get where it got without the solidarity and, I mean, literal financial support of the more established unions in those traditional manufacturing industries.
That's good to mention. Yeah.
It's really cool solidarity history there. But I often use the metaphor as the UFW showed up to the Labor Party right when that party got rolled. And, you think about the reason we had to do that grape boycott, the famous grape boycott, is because we didn't have a legal mechanism to get a union certification. So you had no choice but to call on the consumers to put all this pressure. And I mean, it's remarkable that worked. And it's this really incredible example of activism and the kind of height of the 60s. But then, of course, you got Reagan as governor, and then you got Nixon as president. And, very soon you've got 30 years of Republican governors in California, right? Starting with Duke Menejan and Pete Wilson. Meanwhile, you've got the Reagan Revolution nationally. And so rather than maybe what we had hoped would have happened, which is you would have seen farm worker living and labor standards rise to meet that of the established unions, like the auto workers and the steel workers. Instead, what you had was almost the inverse, where the established unions were gutted. A lot of those jobs went overseas. And if anything, now workers in other industries like gig work, like, Amazon warehouses, now their experiences are probably closer to a farm worker experience than, that classic union middle class life. And so in a way, what we've been having is a convergence of labor standards. But unfortunately, it's just everyone's getting worse instead of farm workers getting better.
Yes, it's very much the immiseration of the working class creates an objective solidarity of position, which is to say that like we're all the canary in the coal mine in some ways, or like the leading indicator of where the working class precarity was going was to look at farm workers and see how they were sort of excluded from even the good old days, if you will, of.
I don't know if you're referencing this on purpose, but that's actually Cesar Chavez quote, that farm workers are the canary of society.
That's hilarious. I didn't know that, but yeah.
Yeah, he said that in the context of pesticide exposure and pesticide regulation. Though I thought of it a lot during COVID, right? These are workers who were deemed essential. You can't pick a tomato over Zoom, right? When we talk about food security or hunger, right? There's a huge labor component to that often gets erased. But I mean, one of the ironies of the moment we're in now is it was actually the first Trump administration. I mean, Donald Trump was president during COVID in 2020, when the Department of Homeland Security designated agricultural work as essential critical infrastructure. And this whole term we use now, essential worker, actually originates in the Trump DHS. And it was the Trump administration that said these farm workers are essential. And for us to go from that to where we are now, where these farm workers are being treated as disposable, is, I mean, it's the height of hypocrisy. It's a great injustice. And it's just really, really profoundly unfair.
Well, it's also a contradiction, which so like on the one hand, you identify agricultural workers as essential, and that shouldn't even be like contested. Shouldn't even be controversial to say or to recognize that. And ICE raids are going after them with full force, right? They're the ones who are being like most terrorized at this point. But it's in that contradiction that like there's an obvious problem to like shoot up a signal flare about, like that we can agitate around that. because it's not sustainable. You cannot indefinitely purge the same labor force that you identify as critical. I mean, and also, who's
Well,
going to do it if you do that?
that's actually you're maybe slightly more optimistic about me than me on that question. I think actually what you've been seeing in agriculture is this kind of tension actually sustaining itself. I mean, for decades. I mean, you can go back to the 1920s to talk about this history, right? In 1924, the Immigration Act that often the kind of top xenophobes cite as their kind of role model. I mean, Jeff Sessions would always talk about how the 1924 law was great. This is the law that banned basically all migrants from Asia, most migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is the law that meant that a lot of Jewish refugees in the 1940s and 30s couldn't get to America when they were fleeing the Nazis. That horrible, horrible law in 1924 actually exempted Mexicans specifically because the grower lobby in California and in the West was telling Congress even 100 years ago, hey, we cannot do this work if we do not have Mexican workers kind of here to do the crop, put the crops and such. So ironically, the height of immigration restrictionism in American history had this kind of backdoor for Mexicans. Though, of course, the moment the Great Depression hits, there's Mexican repatriation, right? And then 1950s, again, early 50s, Operation Wetback, which Trump cites a lot, right? So you get these cycles of, we want the labor, but we don't want to give you rights. And I think that's what's happening in a way right now, where for a lot of employers, they supported Trump. And it's not that they weren't aware that this was happening. I think now some of them maybe are starting to get a little bit more alarmed because the raids are actually happening. And of course, no one wants to be the guy whose actual farm is raided. But if you're just hearing about raids out there in the country every now and then, that can be useful as an employer because now your workers are
You
scared.
have the leverage. Yeah, it's
Your
terror.
workers are going to keep their head down, right? I mean, this is something that we are seeing in real time, is that when workers are afraid, it makes it less likely that they'll speak up, right? If they don't have shade and water when it's 110 degrees plus out there in the California fields, when they don't have when their wages are being stolen. And the point I always make, even to there's all these efforts now to have kind of a populist right, a pro labor right, whatever that means. Sometimes I tell these guys, look, even if you only care about American citizen workers in these industries, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of Mexican Americans doing these jobs. Even if you only care narrowly about them, it's not good for the U.S. citizen workers in agriculture or in construction or in hospitality or in restaurants, in any of those industries, when such a large percentage of their coworkers are too afraid to even ask for a raise. So that's where we have to understand immigration enforcement as basically a tool that gets used to discipline the labor force. And what you end up really seeing is the state is using force on behalf of capital. In this case, in the agricultural industry.
Yeah. Stephen Miller, this fuckface Nazi kid, who's Trump's chief of staff. This may cause problems for you. I don't know. But he fucking got all the fucking ICE precincts and the DHS guys in a room and basically chastised them for going after drug lords and criminals with the ICE raids. And he's like, no, target the fucking bodegas, target Home Depot,
Right.
target fucking agricultural fields, literally.
Well, this is what kicked off everything in LA, is that they started going after workplaces, and
It's their
there's been
response
a
to
lot.
Stephen Miller's finger
Yeah,
wag.
they have this. They're under this political pressure to hit a certain quota, and they're doing it. And as they do it, they're hurting a lot of people. And I often get asked about the economic impact of this. Right, what's going to happen to food prices if farm workers disappear? And I honestly don't like that question very much. In part because it actually sets up what could be even more exploitative labor systems, right? I mean, there's already a push by a lot of the agricultural employers and unfortunately some bipartisan members of Congress to actually really not just expand the H-2A guest worker program, which is the kind of legal way to come be an agricultural worker, which I would argue is actually, it's worse than being an undocumented worker, because an undocumented worker can at least cross the street and change farms if they don't like the way they're being treated. your visa is tied to your employer. So it's basically indentured servitude.
Indentured servitude, yeah.
And then, I mean, actually, for a foreign policy podcast, the metaphor I would use is the kafala system in Qatar that was so criticized in the run up to the 2022 World Cup, where they're taking people's passports away from them, right?
That's what human traffickers do, dude. And that's what this legalized system kind of is.
The H-2A system is rife with human trafficking. Employers will force the workers to move around and do things. And again, all this stuff is in theory illegal, but you can look this up. Operation Blooming Onion in Georgia. That was, a multi-year federal investigation that accused, employers and labor contractors of keeping groups of H-2A workers as literally modern day slavery. That's a quote from the DOJ indictment, which is not, the DOJ is not exactly the lefty book club. So I think, these are really serious issues. And unfortunately, some of the rhetoric that's happening now that's just narrowly focused on, well, what's it going to mean for the harvest if there's mass deportations, just sets up as, and this happened historically. Operation Wetback was paired with a continuation of the Bracero program, which is kind of the forerunner of the H-2A program. It's the guest worker program, actually the first guest worker program in American history, which brought Mexican men, I'll mention, including my grandfather, to the United States to do this work. And so I think we need to be really careful here and really emphasize the human costs, right? What this means for individual families, individual communities, and then just get at these deeper kind of democratic questions of, we as a society need to eat. Who do we want to be picking that food? Do we want it to be, fellow citizens who are able to avail themselves of labor law protections and able to participate politically and socially and civically as our equals? Or do we want it to be this underclass of folks who are permanently excluded from citizenship, whether that's because they're undocumented or whether they're here on a non-immigrant visa guest worker program? So I think these are really fundamental questions, and nothing can be more personal than the food we eat, right? I mean, these are the hands that feed you. The last thing that touches a strawberry before you put it in your mouth is a farm worker's hand. So who do you want that hand to belong to? Do you want it to be someone who's equal to you in society, or do you want it to be someone who's excluded from some of the very rights that you take for granted?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned strawberries. Like when I was in basic training, my nickname was Califas because I was identified as first of all, I was darker then, but I also everybody thought I was Mexican, but also I was a California boy kind of through and through. And I spent time in Monterey, California. That was where my first duty assignment in the Air Force. And there's some generational wealth there and stuff from white folks who settled there a long time ago, but mostly it's an immigrant city. It's adjacent to the Salinas Valley. You can't get to Monterey without driving through Salinas. And it's just field after field of strawberries specifically, but also garlic and Gilroy garlic and all that stuff.
Right.
It's just the entire lifeblood of that whole place, that whole Monterey Peninsula area, which is the most beautiful place I've ever been. And it's the most civically alive place I've ever been, in fact. And it's all immigrants. It's run by immigrants. And when even the leisure aspect of taking in the ocean or going to the parks or going to the farmers markets, it's immigrants on all sides of it, and it's farm workers on all sides of it. They're part of the whole this civilization that I experienced, and that was so important to me and is so fully democracy in action. It does not exist but for the ongoing flow of both immigration and the agricultural economy there, on which immigration relies. You just mentioning strawberries just flooded all that on me.
Well, it's funny. I mean, obviously maybe we're starting to skip ahead here, but I mean, I personally know at least 2 Marines who are Hispanic Marines whose parents are undocumented immigrants. I mean, that's just a fact of life in California. I mean, one of the things that I think is so ironic about the current moment.
Everybody knows people like that in California.
It's just a fact of life. It's not political even. And you have all these East Coasters weighing in, being like, oh, why are they flying foreign flags in LA? And I'm like, oh, the Mexican flag is not a foreign flag in LA.
This is
maybe that's the issue here. I mean, you see, I love my personal favorite flag, the flag that I guess most represents me, is that diagonal one that has, it's like diagonal US, diagonal Mexico. It's like the
Hmm.
flags are put into one flag.
Hmm.
And that's just how people feel. I think people don't historically have not felt the tension between being patriotic Americans and being proud Mexicans.
We can talk more about the ice raids maybe in a minute, but I wanted to make sure we got on wax your sort of the origin story for you here. Like, how did you end up with the Julian Castro campaign for president? And then how did you end up at the State Department, which we should probably also talk about a bit?
Yeah. So I guess my life story in brief is basically I grew up in Yolo County, California, near Sacramento. It's a very ag community. I mentioned my grandpa had come to the U.S. as a bracero. I always say I'm second generation American dream, and that really was my parents' generation that, you know, made it, became middle class, and both my parents worked at the University of California, Davis. That's why we were ended up there. But always around me was this poverty, was this, these migrant farm worker populations who, of course, my first language is actually Spanish. I spoke their language, and when the work season began and the migrant farm worker families would come back, new kids would show up in my classroom, and it was like, okay, Antonio, like show like Jose where the bathroom is because you speak Spanish and English, so you're gonna, be assigned to like be the kind of welcome guide for the migrant kids. And I feel like in some way I've never really gotten much further than that. That's still in a way what I feel like I do is try to communicate to kind of maybe the Anglo middle class what's going on in the Hispanic working class. So that's why I got into politics. Immigration reform was really my big issue. So I studied film production in LA, but went into politics and worked for the Castro brothers. I started working for Joaquin Castro, who's also a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. At the time, he was chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Then when his brother ran for president, I was like, I'm all in. Like, I am a kind of progressive Mexican American. There's a progressive Mexican American running. I loved his position on immigration,
Hmm.
how forward he was on that. I loved I remember when he spoke at the 2012 convention, which in hindsight was kind of a high watermark for Democrats and the Latino vote. And, I just looked up to the guy, and honestly, it was a dream that I got to work on his presidential campaign. And I was policy manager on that campaign. That's how we met,
Hmm.
helping put together some of the foreign policy pieces of that campaign. The 2020 primary, I think, has been relitigated at length. I think our experience of it sometimes was there was so much Bernie Warren feuding, and sometimes I feel like we were just trying to be like, hey, we exist. Like, we are also a progressive campaign. Look at us.
Yeah. I mean, so
But
Castro's was one of 4 campaigns that I ended up being on that cycle, but it's
right.
the only in like you were like in the trenches with Julian. I was obviously, you know, remote dialing into the odd call and that kind of thing. But it was the only campaign that I remember fondly. Like he never got his time in the sun, but because of the Bernie Warren shit, but his campaign actually got better as it went on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think people say, I think there was a moral victory there. Obviously, there was not a political victory there. But I do think that he carved out a lane for himself as really the candidate of the forgotten. And I mean, I think part of it politically is he just picked to champion constituencies that really don't have a lot of political power, right? You don't win elections on a coalition of basically homeless folks, asylum seekers, foster children, indigenous populations, right? Like, it really, I mean, I think if you could say what we were going for was probably something similar to the Bobby Kennedy campaign, right? This kind of
That was the vibe to me. Yeah.
poverty tour, right? You're going to the places that no one else is going to. I think he was the only presidential candidate who, during the campaign, actually crossed the U.S. Mexico border in South Texas and like talked to asylum seekers. This was right after a girl drowned in trying to cross the Rio Grande. He went and laid flowers at her grave, and obviously he did not end up president. But I think there is something to be said about the kind of more moral politics that we could have, where people vying for the highest office in the land, nevertheless, are concerned about the issues of populations that are really treated as disposable, right? I mean, so much of the current situation, I mean, and we can talk about this, right? There's trade-offs here, but there's so much discourse right now about, oh, asylum seekers don't poll well. And it's like, okay, well, you've got a 2-year-old girl who drowned. So what do you want us to do?
Yeah, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Um, and so, I think there's a humanity that can be that I think I mean I'm guilty of this too, right? I am a political operator. I'm a communicator. I say things or hear things, and my first thought is, that's not going to pull well, or we should phrase it this way instead. And there's times when you need that, obviously, right? It's a contact sport. You need to win, but I also think that I mean, this is just maybe part of my broader journey is that I'm a Catholic. I want my soul to feel okay. I want to do things that I can feel good about in politics, and sometimes that means you're going to lose them. You're not going to win all the time. But if you're just going for the winner all the time, then like how's anything going to ever change?
Well, that's funny. I mean, like going back to the point you made earlier about food price inflation because of like ICE raids, and you were kind of like trying to decenter that. And it wasn't that, choking off labor supply doesn't increase food costs. It's that that's the wrong way to think about it because
Right.
ultimately the thing that you're centering, if the thing is the price of the food, then you're just going to go find the lowest bidder of labor supply,
Right.
basically, which
Right.
is going to be
Exactly.
exploitative and illegal,
Right. I mean, look, we could make food even cheaper if we didn't pay farm workers anything, right?
Yeah. Let's just
Like
use prisoners.
there's a limit to how far you can go down that argument before you get into a really evil place. And I think, on the farm food conversation, right? I mean, I think there's great conversations to be had about, corporate consolidation, big retail stores, right? I mean, I understand, farmers when they say, oh, we can't control the price, right? We have to sell to, the big supermarket chains at this price. So if you increase our labor costs, that
Yeah,
comes
Walmart squeezing them and
yeah,
that kind
that
of
comes
thing.
out of
Yeah.
our pocket, right? But then the flip side of that is, okay, so it sounds like we've got a messed up system. Why do the poorest people in that chain supply like need to be the ones who bear the cost? Like why do the
Who is
costs
harmed and
saved
who's
have to come
benefiting from
out
this?
of farm workers and not, you know, I mean, and let's be clear here too. I mean, agriculture in California in particular is like a multi-billion dollar industry. Like there's some farmers out there who are doing very well for themselves at a time when most of their workers don't have health care, right? I mean, some of the basic benefits that most people, certainly anyone with a college degree, would expect to have as part of their job, that's just not even on the table, right? So sometimes, I mean, it can be depressing how much it feels like we're fighting for scraps sometimes. But I mean, at the same time, I mean, I've learned, getting a 25-pound bucket of tomato piece rate going from 75 cents to 85 cents, a 25-pound bucket, you know, sometimes it doesn't feel like a lot, but it adds up for workers and it means a lot to them. And I think the most important thing is also just building worker power, right? Having them be the ones who actually negotiated that change. What I love about unionization is it's the one way to improve workers' well-being that's actually driven by the workers themselves. It's not dependent
Mhm.
on, obviously you want allies in office, but it's not dependent on everyone in Congress seeing things your way, which of course is never going to happen anyway. So I think building worker power directly in the workplace is really, really important.
Yeah, and that's actually an important shift that maybe segues back to your personal story a bit. Like what you're describing as a theory of change or even a theory of democracy where it's like bottom up, worker power, we form a block and then that block looks after its interests and advocates for its interests. And then politicians, it's their job to respond to that. You know what I mean?
Right.
And like I don't say this pejoratively, but like the liberal theory of like power and how democracy works and everything is almost the opposite of that, or like it's not bottom up really, it's about institutions in the electoral terrain, and like politics is a thing that happens in Washington.
Well, I think, you have an imperial presidency, and that incentivizes kind of speed running to the end zone of the imperial presidency. Like it's a very tempting
Even
theory
before
to think,
Trump and imperial
right?
presidency, but it's like
Right.
now,
I mean,
yeah,
like
yeah.
if you think about all the powers the presidency has, right? What's the fastest way for any one individual to make a lot of things better, right? To stop ICE raids tomorrow? Well, be president, right? So it's tempting. I get it. But I do think that, the incentives start to be wrong very fast. I mean, we talked about this with Julian Castro, where I think he did a lot of good stuff, but the political incentives for doing it were probably not there.
Mm.
And, I admire a man personally who's willing to go out there and say, this is who I am and I'm running for president and I'm going to be myself while I do it. And that's kind of the opposite, though, of kind of what a lot of what we have going on, right? Where candidates think about, if I take this or that position, I'm going to antagonize this or that powerful interest or this and that major donor, and I don't want to touch that. And it is what it is, but it can constrain. It can constrain.
But you were in that. The reason I mention it is because in the Biden administration, you ended up going to the State Department and then working for Tony Blinken for a
Yeah,
while.
well,
Tell me about
I
that.
guess the in between steps is Julian Castro dropped out. He endorsed Elizabeth Warren. He was, I mean, honestly, again, just a
That's how
stand-up
I
guy.
ended up working for Warren as well. But yeah,
I mean, he look the Warren team really received me with open arms. I mean, they took us shipwrecked Castronauts in, and I was on the Warren policy team too.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm proud of some of the work I did there. And I mean, I'll just say I was very young and I did not have the credentials that some of the other folks on that team had. And, it was a little bit of like a awe-striking experience. But I got to meet a lot of the really smart folks in the Warren orbit. And, I really benefited from that politically. That certainly influenced my thinking on economic issues. I think in fairness to Castro, we really were focused maybe more on some of the identity issues,
Mhm.
marginalized people issues, I guess, because certainly, looking at really poor folks too. But
In that moment, class was not as central to even progressive
yeah,
thinking as it is now.
which I think was a mistake. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll own that. I think we actually overdid the identity politics. It kind of as the left in that
Yeah.
era.
Yeah.
But yeah, but then Warren also dropped out, and I was able to, I did some volunteer policy work, much like you did, for the Biden campaign. I was connected to a lot of the Biden folks, and then when Biden won, I mean, first and foremost, I was ecstatic because I viewed Trump as a
Not
disaster.
Trump. Not
Yeah,
Trump one
and
is
it's
what.
just, it was just great news, right? I mean, you're in the middle of the pandemic, and at least here's some good news. And then I was asked if I wanted to come work in the admin, and I said sure. I should mention I was back to working for Joaquin Castro as one of his Hill staffers, and I wasn't even told what I was applying for. They just said, do you want to be in the admin? Apply to this. And I said, what's it for? And they're like, we'll tell you later. Turned out I was, being looked at for a job in the Blinkin office. Of course, I'd heard of Tony Blinken. He was the head of the Foreign Policy Volunteer Network that I had been kind of a small part of. And I got the job. I went through an intensive security clearance process, a very intense interview process. For me, I mean, genuinely, I know this sounds corny, but like it was a huge honor to be asked to serve my country, to be I mean, to work at the State Department, right? There's an element of like, I'm representing my country. And that was very meaningful for me. And I think healed in a real way, healed whatever residual chip I had on my shoulder about being Mexican. Now all of a sudden, you have a U.S. diplomatic passport, and you get to say to yourself, I mean, look, how much more assimilated can you get than working in Mahogany Row? I guess let me put it that way. I mean, that really is the pinnacle of kind of the ancient WASP establishment, right? So,
And you worked in Blinken's office. I mean, you were
yeah, no,
right. Yeah.
I was one of three special assistants, and the other two special assistants were career foreign service or civil service officers. So it was kind of a very interesting role. It was not a policy making role. It was basically a process role, a bureaucracy role. My job was paper, right? I mean, it was always, do you have paper for this meeting? Do you have paper for this, call? task paper. That was really my job.
Unfortunately, this is like one of these situations where it's like you get what you want, but do you want what you're going to get? Because it's like this, Blinken, you were not there once October 7th happened. You were already moved on. And so you weren't there for the worst of facilitating a genocide and the war crimes. You were kind of there at the high water mark, if you will, of the Biden administration, but you've also become very critical. I mean, not unlike this podcast,
Yeah.
of Biden foreign policy. So like, just how do you reflect on all of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, again,
Lincoln is not a friend of the pod, obviously. So
I have conflict, I have actually like very intense personal feelings about the people involved. And I know probably this is not a popular thing to say on this podcast. I think Tony Blinken is a good person. I think he he means well in his heart of hearts. I think there was very clearly a choice that was made, and I actually think it wasn't. I think it actually wasn't made at the start. I think it was made when Ukraine started to preserve American primacy as kind of the main goal of the administration, and it was always there, right? I mean, the Biden
it
rhetoric
was
during the campaign.
wallpaper in the
Well,
background.
there,
Yeah.
there was this idea of, America's back. We need to restore America's role in the world. We need to do this. Part of it was coming from the Democratic base, right? This idea of, Trump is bad because he talks to dictators, right? Which is actually strangely a mirror image of the critique of Obama, right? That he was willing to talk to Iran without concessions first, right? And it's like,
It's a
oh
very
my,
conservative position, in fact.
right.
So it's like weird for the Democrats.
Look, and you can track this stuff with where a lot of prominent, more important than me, political figures have moved. You've got a lot of folks who were very, neoconservative Republicans in the early 2000s are now, Democrats. And I think that reflects how some of the parties are shifting on these issues. And I think foreign policy was a big explanation for the Obama-Trump voter phenomenon, right? These are people who, certainly my whole lifetime, right? I was born in 1995, and one of my earliest memories is 9/11. We've been having, forever wars my whole life, and I think people are reacting negatively to that. And if Barack Obama, hope and change is who's going to do it, great. And if Donald Trump, make America great again, who's going to do it, great. I think there's people who really think that way, and that's important to recognize. But we came in with this kind of rhetoric of, okay, America's back. We need to restore America's role in the world. But at the same time, the first real issue that I intensely worked on was the Afghan withdrawal, which I believe was the right decision to make, and I think is actually going to age as Biden's best foreign policy legacy, is that he did in fact end America's longest war.
Oh, it
And
had to happen. I mean, like, yeah, inevitable.
and well, I mean, I think that the tragedy of the way that the lesson has gone is, you know, I mean, there was more coverage in the mainstream media of the withdrawal than there was of like 10 years of the war. I mean,
Yeah.
and I
Nobody
look,
cared until we pulled out.
well, I mean, and it's, look, I mean, it's dramatic. Again, this was a very intense period of my life, and I got to prep the briefing book with the bios of the 13 service members who were killed in Kabul. So Secretary Blinken would have their names when he went to Dover Air Force Base and did the dignified transfer ceremony. Like I learned those names, and I found out what towns they were from, and some of them were very working class Mexican Americans from South Texas and Coachella Valley, California, where my wife is from. And so, I felt that I did, but and you look at the action, when the numbers, you had almost 500 service members killed the first year of the Obama surge. The political price, I think, paid between, compare the price Obama paid for the surge with the price Biden paid for the withdrawal. And it's just a really unfortunate reality that the political incentives are exactly inverse. Let's not, I mean, we should acknowledge the Afghan civilians, but even if you're looking narrowly at US service members are who I care about, fewer US service members died under Joe Biden than under first term Trump, either Obama term or either Bush term. That's a fact. And yet somehow Joe Biden ended up being the one who paid this huge political price for the withdrawal, not for the war. So I think that's something that I think I struggle with a lot, where I do feel, and I think what happened afterwards, if I can kind of armchair general post-game quarterback this, I would say that I think the critique of the Afghan withdrawal got under some of the administration's skin a little bit. I think actually particularly not even the critique from the news media, but the critique from some of the European allies, right? I mean, certainly if you think about President Biden and Secretary Blinken's brand, right? So much of it was we're going to restore our alliances. And I mean, go back and look at what the Europeans were saying during the Kabul withdrawal. It was actually, I think, very unfair. Basically, like why don't the Americans consult us more? Why don't you stay in Afghanistan longer? There were some ugly undertones there. I mean, one of the European concerns was that if we got out of Afghanistan, you would have more Afghan migration to Europe. And it was kind of like, okay, like why would that be a reason for working class U.S. service members to be in Afghanistan? So I think we kind of hit this slump, and then I think what happened in Ukraine is this opportunity to kind of reset the narrative, show that America, forget about Kabul, America is back. We are going to support democracy. What could be more classic than kind of US v Russia? There was this moment that was euphoric where the Ukrainians, against all the odds, are holding the capital. They're beating the Russians. And it was a moment. I remember, I mean, just my personal kind of DC social capital went up because the Ukrainians were winning. And I mean, I went on a lot of these trips to NATO's eastern flank, and it was this kind of moment where it felt like it actually, I mean, and I remember feeling this way. It felt like everything there was a moment of coherence of we're going to build back better at home. We're going to stand up to authoritarianism abroad. We can Defense Production Act our way to a social democracy. There was a kind of arsenal of democracy, New Deal spirit that was very contagious. And I personally bought into it and was very proud of the work we did. And I still think that on net, we did more things right than wrong on Ukraine. I think there is an argument to be made now that we may have missed the optimal window for pushing for a diplomatic settlement, and that kind of the maximalist military victory approach, we kind of made the classic, gambler on a hot streak mistake.
It's a good way to put
it. We didn't know when to, cash the cards in. But of course, in fairness, it's hard to tell, right? I mean, the September 2022 offensive went well. Should we have pushed for diplomatic settlement in April of 2022? Knowing that September 2022, the Ukrainians liberated territory, and I really don't want to undersell the really horrific experiences that were experienced by Ukrainian populations under Russian occupation. But and you mentioned this. This is around the time when I left the Biden administration. I left in September of 2022, took the job with the UFW, have been here ever since. The Biden administration was great for farm workers, did a lot of really important things. Probably more than any president previously had done. I mean, certainly on the domestic labor front, Joe Biden was the real deal. And I know that there's very valid critiques to have of him for Gaza and for foreign policy overall. If I had to understand what happened in Gaza, my belief is that they made the mistake of interpreting that issue through a similar lens to Ukraine and thinking of it as this is a democratic U.S. ally under attack by authoritarian kind of rivals, Iranian proxies, whatever. And they tied the issues. I mean, literally, they packaged the Ukraine aid and the Israel aid together as a narrow political. That was
an actual supplemental bill at one point. Yeah,
right. I mean, they packaged it together because there was a number of Democrats who would probably not have voted for standalone Israel aid, and there was definitely many Republicans who are not going to vote for standalone Ukraine aid. So what do? Well, they package it together and then everyone votes for both. But I think the mistake that made actually, I mean, I feel for the Ukrainians in this case, where, I mean, if you're a Ukrainian, diplomat, you're trying to get support in the global South, for example, South Africa, to help put diplomatic pressure on Russia, and now you are literally tied to, in the global South's view, with some of the worst war crimes that have been committed against a colonized population in, I mean, decades. I mean, arguably, certainly going back to World War II is just really, 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 it's unfortunate for the Ukrainians. And I think that for the US population, it really delegitimized I mean, certainly in the view of the kind of a lot of young people, a lot of working class people, a lot of even just swing voters, this entire project of American global leadership that President Biden was really invested in was just totally delegitimized every day by watching children die in Gaza. And you think, gosh, if this is what U.S. global leadership is, it's not good.
And it's important to stress too, like, it's not just that like Gaza has been this generational atrocity that's still ongoing as an anomaly. Like, the problem is that like when it makes you start to scratch the surface of US foreign policy, and then you start to see the myriad injustices, the myriad hypocrisies, the summit of democracies. You know what I mean? Like, there's good intentions behind that on some level, but it's like you were fucking laundering the Saudi Arabia. You were like going after MBS as like head chopper, ostracizing him on those grounds, and then you're feting him. You ignore Hindu
Yeah,
fascism coming out of India, and you sell them
yeah,
weapons and invite them to the White House. The last summit of democracy, so called, was hosted by fucking South Korea. Guess who was president? The guy who tried to self coup one
right.
year,
Well,
like
I
not
think
even a year later.
yeah, and look, I mean and I'll say like some of this stuff was happening when I was there, some of it wasn't, but I think on the Saudi Arabia point, I mean, and you see this with the Europeans too, right? If you're going to if you're going to try to undermine the Russian like energy economy, you don't have a lot of good choices, at least, right? I mean, you're sanctioning Russian gas. Let's be real. High gas prices hurt working people. I mean, I think certainly farm workers get around with combustion engines, right? And we can talk about climate, we can talk about that, but basically your choices in this world are, you know, keep buying Russian gas, which that doesn't seem good. Increase domestic energy production, which has climate repercussions, or go to the Middle East. Geopolitics often has no good options, but I think that in a way where Trumpism succeeds over Bidenism is it leans into the transactionalism. It leans into, these are our narrow national interests, and, values are not important. I think what where democratic foreign policy sometimes actually, I think, gets caught is we hold ourselves to a standard that we then don't meet. That's a problem. And I've thought a lot about this, and I do think the next democratic foreign policy needs to be a much more restrained one, and needs to, I've certainly, for me, focused a lot on international solidarity among people, among working people. I think we should really think about things like, okay, we don't like these governments sometimes, but are sanctions actually helpful, or are we just hurting a lot of working people?
Yeah.
For example. But at the same time, if you're on the National Security Council in the Democratic Socialist, administration, hopefully comes in 2029, you're going to have to make some hard choices. And certainly if you're hoping to do the level of domestic spending that I believe we need to do on our social services, we're going to have to reduce military spending. I mean, we're going to inherit a massive deficit from this administration. Inflation, as we just learned, does create political costs among working class constituencies. There aren't easy answers here, but we need to, I think, have a foreign policy that works backwards from what's the change we want to see at home, right? Okay, if I want to reduce the military budget by X amount because I want to build a public hospital in every rural county in America that does not currently have a hospital, period. Okay, what does that mean for military spending? And if that means it's going way down, then what does that mean for our Asia policy, where, okay, we cannot have a carrier group in the Red Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean and in East Asia all the time, which means what has to happen diplomatically to make that situation okay, basically. So everything, my view here is you're going to have State Department officials doing diplomacy with all sorts of countries, working backwards from the premise of, I need to figure out a way to reduce our military commitments so that the Department of Health and Human Services can go, provide free dental checkups to people who've never had one in their life.
This is why primacy is such an obstacle to everything good in the universe, because it's primacy that justifies or necessitates having these aircraft carrier dilemmas across regions. It's
Right.
primacy that necessitates that we respond to Ukraine in a certain kind of way involving deep sanctions on Russia without, I mean, so this is actually a good example. Bernie's been pretty good on Ukraine throughout. He issued a statement like literally right after Putin invaded, and he was very clear-eyed about like Putin is the naked aggressor here, full stop. The question is like, why is this happening and what do we do about it? And he was like, look, we need to sanction the oligarchs, but we should not be just sanctioning Russian oligarchs. Like all the oligarchs are a fucking problem, especially the
Right.
American ones. So we're engaging in a sort of like selectivity there. But
Yeah.
also the more important thing to your point about like, you have to cozy up to Saudi Arabia because you need their oil to manage the oil markets because we're sanctioning Russian oil and gas. You can make a kind of realpolitik calculation like that. And clearly the Democrats did. The problem with that just like simmering in the hypocrisy where Bernie went different and where progressive foreign policy, where it would have gone different, is like, this is why you accelerate a green transition. You cannot do the realpolitik thing except in the context of also accelerating the green transition. Like,
Right.
you have to address the root causes if you're going to do realpolitik reaction to whatever's happening, like, so it's not
Yeah.
ignore reality. It's like deal with reality while trying to make a better reality. And the Democrats
Right.
gave up on that, trying to make the better reality.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was much easier for me, just personally, emotionally, politically, to get behind kind of American primacy in 2022 when the people, I joked, yeah, Lockheed Leftism, yeah, we can have a, you know,
Oh my God.
we can, as long as the jobs are union and the bombs are going to help the Ukrainians free their country, great. But then what happens when, oh, wait, no, the bombs are going to kill civilian children in the Middle East kind of indefinitely for no reason, really, right? Like literally no reason that
So
serves the.
how did you fall out of love with Lockheed Leftism? Let's put it that way.
I mean, the one word answer is Gaza.
Yeah.
I think that was something that I struggled with, and I had friends who were more progressive than me. I was a former admin guy, and I tried to really give the administration the benefit of the doubt for as long as I could. And I would, I talked to people who were in the admin and they would say, oh, look, we have to keep our influence with Netanyahu or, he's going to do something even worse and we can restrain him and we can use this as leverage. And then there just came a point where I was like, okay, well, then use the leverage, like use the leverage. Fine. You've gotten all this leverage. Use it. Please use it. And it just became really clear. I think for me, the final wake up call was when President Biden said that he had a ceasefire deal, and then Israel said no to it, and then Biden just kind of dropped it.
Nothing. Yeah.
To me, that was the moment of, I mean, again, like I have this kind of patriotic streak where I was like, wait a minute, like I mean, and this is where I almost had a primacy reaction of like, wait, we're the United States. We're funding you. What do you mean no? What do you mean no? Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
who is Bibi Netanyahu to tell President Biden no? It's funny, the conservative critique is often, oh, diplomacy's weak and we can't have weakness on the national stage. I don't think anything in my lifetime has been as weak from an American president as just watching Netanyahu steamroll because Biden, it wasn't even behind the scenes. Biden would go out there, announce the ceasefire deal, and then have to go back and walk it back when the Israelis said no. And that was the stuff where you're just like, man, I mean, I was so relieved. I remember in May of 2024 when the US, Qatar, and Egypt announced the ceasefire agreement. I remember thinking, thank God, okay, they landed the plane. It was a lot uglier than I would have liked to have seen it, but they landed the plane. And then I think when that fell apart, I realized, okay, this policy is just indefensible for me,
Mm-hmm.
basically. That again, I'll be honest, that was emotionally hard. There was a lot of processing, that things that I believed I had understood about the world and my role in it were not true. I
It's
think
tough.
that
I went through the same
yeah,
thing at a certain
yeah,
point. Yeah.
it is what it is. It is what it is. And I think actually a lot of people who are less outspoken than me are going through similar transitions. And I do take a lot of comfort in the fact that regardless of what happens to me, certainly regardless of what happens to you, sorry, Van, I do take some comfort that I think a lot of the people who are likely to serve in future Democratic administrations understand that what went down, certainly in Gaza, but even beyond that, was in many cases just a real failure. And I think the silver lining on the kind of counter primacy argument that you've been making for some time is that I guess the good news of Imperial Decline is primacy is not doable anymore. And I think
Yeah.
that the right has actually figured out its own way of talking and thinking about what does American foreign policy look like in a post primacy world, right? Very transactional, very aggressive, very imperial, right? We want
Imperial,
to
yeah.
we want to, we're in a zero sum race for rare earth minerals, so let's take over Greenland, right? That sort of argument.
Bad luck, Gorman.
Figured out. Yeah, I got a good answer. But I think the left hasn't figured out how to what our foreign policy looks like in a post primacy world, because even a lot of the progressive demands, frankly, still lean on this framework of, okay, well, we can use our massive global hegemony to tweak, improve, social rights in sub-Saharan Africa, or we can, get certain political prisoners freed in Central Asia, right? Like there's still this kind of NGO liberal internationalism thinking that happens in progressive spaces, where I don't think it's a bad instinct. I just sometimes think, I'm like, guys, like the tools to do that are not going to be there. They're not going to survive Trump. And after Gaza, like, do you want the tools to be there? Like, should the US have this much coercive power in the world? I think there's an actual question there for me for the first time in my life of, like, we're not always the good guys.
It's very well said. I think progressive foreign policy, especially as I've spent so much time articulating it, is the way to use state power. Ideally, it's like the optimal way to think about state power and how to use it. And the problem is the conditions do not exist currently for progressive foreign policy. I feel like one way of explaining that is that, like, look, we're often not the good guys, and our uses of state power have a dark side to them, and they generate all kinds of unintended consequences. But also, it's not always good guys who are going to be in charge in America. And so, like,
Right.
we have a responsibility to restrain this. That ought to be the project. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think, and I think and I think politically for Democrats, there is actually, like, I do think on foreign policy, we need to make very clear that we are not the war party, that we are. I mean, I think Matt Duss has written really well about,
mhm.
how Democrats have, we talked about this earlier, how, we've kind of osmosis into our institutions, this kind of neoconservative, kind of historically Republican foreign policy. And I mean, just think about the 2006 midterms, right? Which came right after the last time a Republican president won the popular vote. How did Democrats win the 2006 midterms? They were running against the Iraq War. That was a year of a lot of, like, national security credentialed candidates in the House, but these were mostly anti-war national security credentials. These were people who said, I'm against the war, and I can say that because I served, but I'm against the war.
Mhm.
And somehow, we've kind of lost that, and we've kind of have national security
It's all fucking Alyssa
candidates running.
Slotkins. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I won't say anything. I won't name names, but I think I think Democrats need to rediscover their kind of anti-war roots. I mean, we were the party. I don't think we opposed the Iraq War enough. I mean, clearly not everyone in the party did, but the Barack Obama emerged out of the opposition to the Iraq War, and I think letting that mantle slip was a mistake. I mean, I
Mhm.
think maybe 2016 is where the timeline turned for the worse there. There's a lot we could do better. And I think that if you're going to have a working class politics with economic populism, that I think is what we need to win back working class voters, certainly Latino voters. I think we do need to stand up to what this administration is doing on immigration. I think that is primarily a class issue and should be discussed as such. But I also think there's a foreign policy piece of it, which just has to be super clear that our foreign policy is going to be about making life better at home for working people. And that's going to sometimes mean less involvement abroad.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens with Iran. I think Trump is going to politically, he's going to benefit a lot if he does manage to pull off an Iran deal. I think that is going to be, Democrats can say, look, this is his fault because he tore up the Obama nuclear deal. But the fact of the matter is, if Trump accomplishes that, and avoids another war in the Middle East, that's a genuine win, and we shouldn't poo-poo it. And what worries me every now and then is you see these Democrats who want to get to Trump's right on Iran and say, oh, he's talking to Iran, he's weak, and I just don't think. I mean, again, forget the morality of this. I just don't think there's a path to power again when American voters see you as the party that wants to send their kids to Iran.
It's a loser. It was a loser in 2024 to try and out-hawk Trump. I mean, that's just not, and I think that's not in the interest of working people.
And I will say this, I think one of the things that happened there again is related to Gaza, where they had lost the anti-war vote by then. They'd alienated the anti-war vote so much. So they kind of, I get it. Like, they had no choice politically. Sorry.
All good.
They had no choice politically but to go for that, to go for maybe towards the center, because they felt they'd lost the left. My argument to that was, well, try not to lose the left next time, guys. Like, I think it's going to be better policy, it's going to be better politics, and I think it is going to be something that the future young me's of the world can feel good about. And I do think that's important. I think there's a, I think sometimes the staffer class can get very self-important, but I do think, morale within an administration is a real thing. And I think there was an element of real exhaustion by the end of the Biden administration that I feel like on some mystic spiritual level was this kind of moral attrition. Again, I'm a Catholic, so the kind of this idea of attrition as the wages of sin kind of comes naturally to me.
Well, at a practical level too, like Naomi Klein, I've said this many times. I'm quoting her, but she said that Gaza blew a hole in our moral universe, and now anything can get through. Oh, to close off, how is UFW, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, how are they sort of responding to this moment where California is basically under siege, federalized National Guard, all of it, and it's growing. The escalation from the state is growing, but it's like at the core of this is the desire to like impose white supremacy through immigration raids, right? So how is UFW responding?
I mean, this is going to sound corny, but it's got to be solidarity. I mean, I think what you're seeing in LA is remarkable. What you're seeing around the state is remarkable. People are defending their neighbors. And again, going back to the politics of it, right? You can talk about optics, you can talk about polling. These are people who are defending their loved ones. These are people who are defending their families. Mostly
ICE is basically a foreign force that's coming into communities and trying to break them.
It's a federal intervention, basically, right? I think certainly in the Mexican American community, I think it is giving rise to a lot of political consciousness. I don't know where we go from here, to be honest, but I know where I want to go, and that is we need working people to look out for each other, to defend each other, and I hope that one of the things that I'll say is I think it's causing real damage to the Latinos for Trump. I know a lot of Latinos for Trump. I'm in those spaces socially, and people, you can critique them for this. You can say, oh, what idiots or whatever. Some people will say, I don't believe you should ever demean a voter, but people did not believe that he was going to go after good people. People have said that, oh, I thought he was going to go after the bad ones. And now people are seeing, really just salt of the earth people who are just trying to make ends meet, put food on their tables, who put food on our tables, getting caught up in this. And I hope that can be the beginning of a healthier conversation, or we get past this just baseline, if you're illegal, you're subhuman. And we get into this place of, who's on our society, who are the people who do the really essential work, and how do we treat them well. And I will say, I think any healthier foreign policy has to also start there. And immigration is absolutely a foreign policy issue. We're talking about people from all over the world. I mean, you want to talk about people-to-people diplomacy? The way people treat immigrants is people-to-people diplomacy. I mean, certainly in Mexico, people are watching what's happening and are pretty shocked, I think, treating a population that's fundamentally an American population, the Mexican American community, which is majority citizen, treating us as we're foreign invaders. And I'm not even going to get into, California as the history there. And obviously,
do you know
you know,
anything about California?
I mean, if you want to talk about American global primacy, it started with the Mexican-American War. And I mean, why did Polk want California? In no small part because he recognized even then that San Francisco Harbor was going to be key to geopolitical mastery of the Pacific. So
Yeah.
you can argue there's a real trend line that goes right through from the 1800s to today. And again, a lot Mexican Americans have been very proud foot soldiers of that imperial project, certainly as rank and file Marines. In my case, as someone in a much more elite position, I think a lot of Mexican Americans are feeling really alienated right now. And when you see people flying Mexican flags, it's not that they're saying that they're not American. It's that they're saying they're kind of heartbroken by America. And I think it's natural when you feel like your ethnic group is under attack. People will respond with ethnic pride. And look, and that might not be healthy either. That for the left, we need multiracial solidarity. We don't need ethnic separatism. And
there's no
so,
reason that somebody's flag should necessitate exclusion, though. Like it
sure.
shouldn't. Like we shouldn't be insecure about the presence of a fucking flag.
I personally embrace both flags. You can look at my Twitter profile. I've got the American flag and the Mexican flag right next to each other because that's who I am and that's how I feel. We need immigration reform. We need a pathway to citizenship. And I absolutely believe that whoever the next Democratic nominee is needs to make that a big part of their platform and their message.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've kept you for maybe too long. This has been really good. And we need to, of course, stay in touch. Maybe do some stuff together.
Hey, thanks for having me. And I will just reiterate that my foreign policy views are my own.
All good. All right. Antonio, man, thanks for doing this. We'll be in touch. This was great.
All right. Thanks, man.
Take care.
Cheers.